Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program. What we're trying to do here is examine the causes of the dysfunction and polarization in our political system and in our government, and offer up solutions for how we can not eliminate dysfunction and polarization, because that won't happen, but how we can move things toward the center in both instances and produce some results to try to drive some compromise in the system, try and get the dialogue back to the middle. In our last show, we talked about how the federal government goes about budgeting in each year, and we walked through the steps. In fact, after the show, I realized I left out a fairly important step, that after Congress passes the budget, the president actually has to sign it into law. That's not always the case. The president may veto the budget, and then you're not exactly starting over again, but you have to go back and certainly work through those wrinkles. So for the civic scholars among you, please accept my apology that we left out the step of the president signing legislation. As you know, when Congress passes legislation or a state legislature passes legislation, part of the system of checks and balances is it has to be signed by the executive branch. So when we concluded last time talking about the budget, and in part of that conversation, what we mentioned is the fact that the United States government invariably today and for most years spends more money than it takes in. So in this particular time, we have a budget, and I apologize for not having the exact numbers, of around $3.8 trillion, but our revenues are probably going to be about $600 billion short of that. So for the current year that we're in, the fiscal year 14, my understanding is that we're going to have $600 billion of debt because of the fact that the revenues don't match up to the expenditures. And since this has been going on for a while and the debt accumulates, as you have a budget from one year to the next, and each year you have more money that you have in the form of a deficit for that year, it adds to the accumulated deficit. So right now we have a very large accumulated deficit for our country. In fact, it's such a big number, I had to bring out the big whiteboard today. So let's take a look. So here we have a very scary number, and I took this number from a site called the U.S. National Debt Clock. And this show is a taped show, so we're doing this in early February. I think this show may not run until sometime in late March, and by then this number is going to be even higher. But this is, I'm going to try and do this, 17 trillion, 261 billion, 748 million, $608,633.98. That is how much money our federal government has in its accumulated deficit from year to year to year to year. Another number I have on the board here is $54,346.44. I'm guessing that many of you have already figured out that this is the amount that our federal government owes for each person in our country. So we have, 350 or 360 million people. You divide our population into the total amount for that day, and that shows you how much debt we have accumulated for each citizen. Now, these are staggering numbers. There have been other times in history where the numbers have been very high, and they're usually associated with time of war, First World War, Second World War. This time, we did have a lot of debt accumulated through the Persian Gulf War and other wars, and then we had the Great Recession. So, as you know, on this show, we're not here to argue issues or whether or not the debt's too high, how to bring the debt down, or whether or not the budget's appropriate. We're trying to here talk about process. So as a function of process, again, the budget is passed, and then the deficit accumulates, and we now are over $17 trillion in debt. Now, how is that debt represented? Well, the federal government borrows money. It issues notes and bonds, treasury bonds and treasury notes. Right now, and that's the bulk of the debt, and we have to pay that off. So part of the problem here is that when you have to pay off debt, you have to pay interest. I think the average interest rate right now on all our debt is very low. It's like 2 to 2.5%. So if you do a quick math here, 2 to 2.5% of 17 billion suggests that we pay about 350 billion a year in debt. It's a lot of money, 350. But that's when the interest rates are low. There have been times when the debt on the government, when the interest rate on the government debt has been 4, 5, 6%. So if we get to an inflationary environment in our country, and the cost of that debt starts to spike up, for every 1% of that debt, we are going to be spending an additional $170 billion a year just to pay the interest. So this is the situation we're in, but it's an example. For purposes of today's conversation, one of the things I want to talk about is the dysfunction created around the budget and around the deficit numbers. And this is where the dysfunction comes in, and I find it to be very disingenuous. The country is borrowing money, and in order to borrow that money, periodically there is a ceiling that gets set, which is called the debt ceiling. You've heard the debt ceiling talked about a lot. And the debt ceiling basically says this is the most we can spend without taking another snapshot of what's going on here. All of us have credit cards, and on our credit cards we have limits. When we get to that limit, we have a couple choices. One choice is we have to pay down to create some room. We can contact the credit card company and say, look, I need a little more credit. Can you increase the line? Can I have more credit? And that's the conversation that takes place in Congress at a much higher level and a much bigger number. Should we have more debt? Now, given the scenario of how government operates, it's very hard at any one particular time to trim that debt because it's a moving target. But you would think that you could have serious conversations around the debt and around the budget, and we haven't had those for quite a while. Again, thankfully, we now have a federal budget, but we have a growing deficit. In fact, one of the things, and I'm going to digress here for a second, that I find very disingenuous is when you hear our politicians talk about the fact that they have lowered the debt. They are not lowering the debt. If you hear any politician say that they have lowered the debt, you need to call them on that. If anything they've done is in any particular year, we have less debt than we did the year before. So in this particular year, we have $600 million of new debt. The year before, it was more. So what they're really trying to say is we added less debt this year than we added the year before. But the reality is the total debt is growing. It's growing every minute. And if you look at this U.S. national debt clock, and I'm sure if you go to Google, there's a lot of places that have similar numbers, you'll see that this number keeps growing all the time. So please don't be confused when they say the debt has been lowered. All they're talking about is a relative number from one year to the next, whereas a cumulative debt keeps growing. Our first guest today is Freida Wallison. Freida is the chair of the Pitkin County Republicans. And what we're going to do today is continue our discussion about civility or lack of civility in politics, and did we ever have it, and how we lost it, and can we get it back? Freida is a Harvard-educated attorney, which puts me at a significant disadvantage for this conversation. And I was looking at her bio. She's obviously had terrific accomplishments within the law, but she's branched out the law. She was actually a trustee for the Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington. We could probably have a more interesting conversation about what the Shakespeare Theater Company did in Washington, but we're going to stick to politics today. And if I have to say anything about Freida Wallison, I've known her for about 8 years now, and when I think of Freida, I just think of someone who's a class act. And I don't think anyone could meet Freida and have a different opinion. And if you do, then you and I won't be civil with each other, because she is definitely a class act. Particularly given being involved in politics and playing an influential role in politics, I always known her to have an even keel, and never really say something that I thought was out of the ordinary or disrespectful to anyone. So it's a pleasure to have her with us today on the show. So welcome, Freida.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, not only a class act, I have to tell you, when we were starting to get ready for filming today, the crew here said, "Who's your guest?" And I said, "Freida Wallison." And their faces lit up. They said, "Freida comes in all the time, and she's a class act." So I stole their line.
This is wonderful. I think I'll leave now.
So is that the ultimate oxymoron, chair of the Pitkin County Republicans and class act?
No, not at all. See now, where's your civility?
No civility, exactly.
No, I frankly, being chair of the Pitkin County Republicans is very interesting. It's also a challenge in a town or county that tends liberal. And obviously we tend to have some different perspectives on a lot of issues. And it's interesting to try to get our perspective across, not necessarily agreed with, but across in a way that can be understood by people who have a different view.
Now I'm trying to remember. I don't recall exactly. You didn't exactly campaign for this job, wasn't it? Kind of
Correct.
thrust upon you
Yes,
in
that's
an
right.
opportune time.
Well, that's right. It was the middle of the 2008 presidential campaign, and my predecessor had spoken with me about possibly becoming chair, and we agreed that it would make sense to do that if I was going to do it after the campaign season. But for one reason or another, in September of 2008, my predecessor decided to step down, and I stepped up.
Well, you can't just step up without people knowing how talented you are, but you also can't step up unless you are ready for that. So take us back a bit, somewhere after Harvard Law School and between becoming chairman. Were you active in politics early on? How did you get started in politics? And
I wasn't active in the way I am today as chair, and but I have been around politics for most of my life, both in New York City, where I practiced law part of my career, and in Washington, D.C., and mostly, I think, as a result of my husband's being as involved as he was in government positions. And it's hard to be in that milieu and not be part of politics. And then, of course, some of the things I did in my career, particularly when I was in Washington, were not strictly political, but I was operating in a political environment. I was a member of a 5-member commission that was appointed by, I was a presidential appointee to study the state of the nation's infrastructure. That's a pretty political kind of situation. I was also vice chair of the Financial Advisory Board of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. That was pretty political because we were wrestling with the question of cost-benefit from environmental regulations. And you had folks on one side who thought that that should not even be a consideration, that what needed to happen was regulation of the environment, and the costs associated with that were unimportant. People on the other side, of course, thinking that these things should be balanced, and the cost was important in determining whether a regulation would be put in place. So almost anything one does is political in a sense. Right. But I was clearly heavily involved in some sense vicariously through my husband when he had various governmental positions.
Right, and when you say your husband, Peter Wallison, was an earlier guest on our show. We talked about campaign finance reform with him, and if I recall correctly, he was counsel to President Reagan, or was in the White House counsel capacity.
He was White House counsel.
And then later was general counsel to Treasury.
Before being White House counsel,
I got him
he
reversed.
was general counsel. He also, at one point in his wanderings, was counsel to Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. And before that, he was a special counsel to Nelson Rockefeller while Rockefeller was governor of New York. So we've been in and out of politics in a lot of different
But
capacities.
in those days and in those roles, you were more at the policy level. I mean, you're helping to create policy and discuss implications of government.
Well, he certainly was.
But even on these commissions you were part of.
But on the commissions I was part of, yes, very much so. But politics also, you know, policy is politics, and politics is policy also. So I don't necessarily see a separation. I do think that policy is critical, you know, you want to be sure that you're doing the right thing, aside from whatever the quote politics of the matter is or are. And so policy lies, I think, at the base of what people do in Washington and what people involved in the political arena care about.
And I agree with you. So when you were on these commissions, and had you been appointed by a Republican president?
Yes. Well, I was appointed by Ronald Reagan.
By Reagan.
To the Commission on Infrastructure. And maybe it was because of that that the folks at the Environmental Protection Agency, still in the Reagan administration, thought that it would make sense for me to be on this other board.
I guess what I was trying to get at is you obviously have an amazing intellectual capacity. You have curiosity about these issues you're dealing with. But as a presidential appointee, do you feel you're also there, as you said, maybe wearing a little bit of a political hat, so that as decisions are getting made, that's kind of in the back of your mind?
I think what I was trying to get across is that if you're a member of a board or a commission like that, I wasn't necessarily thinking what would Ronald Reagan want me to conclude as a member of this commission. I was really thinking at the time of, what makes most sense.
Right.
And there was a sense at that particular moment that, and I think it's true probably today too, that not enough attention is being paid to our infrastructure in the country, and that could be a problem. Somehow we managed to get through all this, but so the politics of thinking about that, there are politics involved, but it wasn't, but more in the sense of how do you reconcile a lot of different perspectives on what should be done and where should it be done and how much should it cost. There are lots of different views on that, and so that's where I think the politics comes in.
Gotcha. So somewhere along the line, though, we have to transition you to becoming the chair of the
Yes.
party, and being chair of the party is as pure politics as you can get. You're trying to get people elected. So
That's true.
Where did you grow into someone who might be able to wear that kind of a hat?
Well, as you said, this wasn't something that I necessarily sought. It was thrust upon me. But having had it thrust upon me and having thought about whether this is something I was willing to undertake, I stepped in and I decided I would try to make the best of it and do as good a job as I could. Whether I've done that is another question, and it's a continual challenge. And if I have the sense that I spend about 40 hours at minimum a week on this. There is always something to be done, always some other, thing, some email to send, some challenge,
Yeah.
some email to send out to our network about some topic, some candidate, whatever, working with candidates. We have a lot of candidates coming to Pitkin County, so working with them and coordinating that, developing programs, which we've tried to do on a fairly regular basis, that will, that involve people who have ideas and thoughts about topics of the day.
And I tip my hat to you, because I am on your email list, and I think you bring in great speakers, and I've been to some of your sessions, and I think you really do a great job of educating people who want to come up to speed on contemporary issues.
That's that's a big part, and another way to talk about politics is to say it really does involve education, because if you're involved in this sphere, you want to tell people, make them aware of why you think the way you think on a particular issue, or why a particular candidate thinks that way. So, that's the essence of education. You're trying to get a point across and convince somebody else that why it's important and what it means.
So you've had a couple interesting election cycles. You were
Yes.
you were thrust into the election in 2008 on the cusp
Right.
of Obama being elected, and then you've now gone through a whole cycle for the Obama-Romney election. So
Yes.
what lessons have been learned throughout that in terms of your approach to elections and how you think about elections.
Well, you know, as a party hack,
Your word, not mine.
right, I'm not sure that that there's our role is to try to support the candidate by talking with other people about the candidate, trying to convince them that the candidate should be elected. To some extent, the ebb and flow of a campaign is outside our control. We're not on the campaign team, so we're not in a position to advise the candidate. But of course, that also depends on gradations. Typically not in a position to advise a presidential candidate on what his or her position should be or the direction of the campaign. But we do often get involved at a lower level, for example, state house representative, state senate senator, in a more fundamental way on what are the issues, how should they be presented in Pitkin County at least, and that sort of thing.
So let's switch over a little bit then. When we get to issues, I want to talk about civility. These candidates come through town. I assume a lot of them are going to be interviewed by the newspaper.
Right.
So do you help them
Yes.
prepare for that give and take with the paper?
Well, no, but I do certainly help set up those kinds of meetings.
Would you tell them?
But I don't tell them what they should say, or, you know, maybe I'll say, you know, these are the issues that are important to people here, and if you could focus on one or another, it would be important. Yes, I have been known to say that.
So what is your perspective on civility? I mean, most people think we're losing civility if we ever had it. In fact,
Yeah.
before the show started, that was your quip. Did we ever have it, right?
Well, I do think there's that question, whether we ever had it, but I think that it's clearly not a very good situation right now. And I give a fair amount of thought to this. I think we're living in an age of where people really are, I suspect, more separated from each other than they were before. By that I mean people of like mind tend to read the same material on the internet or newspapers, watch the same television programs, if they're, you know, involving current affairs. Don't really get down to discussions with each other if they have opposing perspectives, so that there's a lot of reinforcement of views that are held to be truths on both sides. And so I think that's one of the problems. The two sides don't get together and talk. And so what they're both getting are reinforcements of their, you know, wherever they started out. There's also a tendency to, you know, the world is very complicated right now, and it's very difficult to get facts, and people marshal facts, even if they get them, to reinforce their particular perspective. And facts are very malleable, so you can find facts that are going to support your view, and the other side's going to find facts that support their view. I mean, just the topic of the day on the CBO report, Congressional Budget Office
Right.
report on the question of how much full-time employment will there be in 10 or so years.
As a function of Obamacare.
As a function of Obamacare. And, you know, the Republicans are looking at that one way, and the Democrats are looking at it a rather different way.
And we've said on the show many times, politics is a contact sport.
Yes.
I mean, it's not all niceties.
Right.
But it seems to me we've lost our ability to compromise, and what bothers me is the words that get spoken in this environment you're talking about. They're very heated words. They're very contentious, heated words, and I don't remember that even 20 years ago.
Right.
And so how have we transitioned to this point?
I can't, you know, recall. I'd have to generally agree with you, Steve, because I can't recall where people were calling each other names. And there's a lot of name calling on both sides. I think that and I view that as somewhat different than compromise. I mean, lately we have seen that the parties in Congress have compromised on some legislation. They've just recently compromised on the Farm Bill. The Republicans didn't get everything they wanted. The Democrats didn't get everything they wanted. There was, in fact, after a bit of unpleasantness, a compromise on the budget. So, but that's different in my view from the question of how do people talk with each other about issues. There's where I think the civility factor comes in. And I do think that leadership is very important. I think leaders have to bear a heavy responsibility in providing a model for people at lower rungs of the ladder, and how to talk about to the other side. So I think in many instances leaders have failed. I also think that journalists bear a heavy responsibility in this regard, and the journalists are really, they're off,
Correct.
you know, the deep end. Peter just had an op-ed in the New York Times that attracted a lot of attention, and there was a blog in the Columbia Journalism Review by one of the editors of that review. This is the review for Columbia University School of Journalism. And it was headed, in reference to my husband's opinion piece, "The Big Lie." Now, when journalists are talking in that sense, particularly journalists associated with one of the premier academic institutions in journalism in the country, you really despair, actually, about anybody talking civilly about anything to each other. Another example, I was watching one of the pundit programs on the Sunday morning talk shows on television, and subject was Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, and Ezekiel Emanuel, Rahm Emanuel's brother, one of his brothers, who Ezekiel Emanuel was very involved in the formulation of the Affordable Care Act.
Is he a physician, I think?
He is a physician. I think he's currently the, and this is also, to me, very astounding, he's the provost or vice provost of the University of Pennsylvania. And he was on the show with, this particular show, with a guy named James Capretta, who is also an expert in health economics and that sort of thing, healthcare economics. And the conversation got very heated. And at one point, the moderator said to Ezekiel Emanuel, "Well, isn't Mr. Capretta making a good point?" To which Ezekiel Emanuel said, "I don't care what he's saying. He's only saying something because he wants to defeat the Affordable Care Act." Well, when you start out with that perspective, that you're not going to listen to somebody else with another view because you are suspicious that he is only out to undermine you or your position, then you never get to a conversation and you never get to determine whether either one of you is making valid points.
And I think that's what we're doing. When people are talking at each other, not with each other.
Right.
And again, the language is horrible. And you referenced
Right.
calling people a liar, which seems to
Right.
be okay now.
That's
Calling the president a liar seems to be okay now.
True. True.
I never thought we'd get to that point in time.
Right.
Even if you thought the president made a mistake or misspoke,
right.
you didn't take it to the level
You
that
didn't
I
use
think
the
we're at
L
today.
word. L word.
You definitely didn't use the L word. So how do we get back? How do we get back here? How does the Republican Party, how's the chair of the Pitkin County Republican Party help us get back to some modicum of civility here? Is there any?
Well, I think we truly make an effort to, some of us anyway, talk with, I should say, not talk to, but talk with people who have a different viewpoint. And I think in this town, it's really incumbent upon us to do that. We are outnumbered. We want to be able to talk to people. So I think that it's pretty important. An important part, certainly, of how I see my role is to say, I'm a Republican for this, and this reason, and I'd like to have a conversation with you. And I do that, you know. So, and it always has to be on a very civil, even keel basis.
Right now, as a Republican, as the chair of the party, how much tension do you feel with the Tea Party element and the fact that a lot of people want to blame them for their, I hate the word extreme, but they get blamed for extreme positions of wanting to shut down government. Is there a lot of tension in your job? Do you feel that at the local level, or is that just, that's not in Pitkin County yet?
I don't think I feel that quite so much. I think it is a factor in the Republican Party in Colorado and probably in many other states. I think the Tea Party started out on a very well-founded basis of concerns about the deficit and debt and fiscal matters generally. It seems to have morphed a bit into a more intense emotional kind of approach to things. And I think that may possibly be because there are a lot of people who identify themselves as Tea Party people who have not been involved in politics before, have a rather blunderbuss approach to dealing with the issues, and maybe over time that gets modulated a bit. But I think that certainly some of the, maybe most of the principles that seem to have animated the formation of the Tea Party are still of concern. Budget, deficit, spending, taxes, all of those kinds of things. So, but I haven't felt particularly affected by that.
Now we have our political leadership.
And I might also say, if I may, that Democrats seem to have had great success in evoking the Tea Party as an evil group. I mean, that's sort of how it comes across. If you say Tea Party, it's to describe somebody who's evil.
And again, I think
the government shutdown, which was a very bad way to go, in my view, however, served to illustrate that there are a diversity of views within the Republican Party. There were Republicans who were for pushing this question of funding or defunding Obamacare to a shutdown if necessary, and there were a lot of Republicans who thought that was foolhardy and should not be pursued. And I think that at the end of the day, it gave some of us relief that, yes, it was clear that there were different points of view within the Republican Party, and it wasn't right to label everybody as a Tea Party person with the connotation that Tea Party is evil. So.
Now someone said, maybe Shakespeare, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't see sausages or legislation being made.
Yes.
Do you think we just see too much of it? Do you think we see every little snippet of every little action and every little sentence that anyone would be better off if we didn't have all that information and we could,
well, I don't know
too much
about
information a bad thing here?
Well, it might be. I think there's a tendency when you have too much information to try to boil it down to a very simple slogan, if you will, to make it understandable, both on the part of the person who's getting the information and on the part of the person who's giving it. So, so that's not good. And we do have too much information, but we're always going to have too much information.
That
and
one we can't put back in the bottle.
And we can't put it
No,
back in the bottle, and I think we got to learn how to deal with it, but do it in a calmer way, and say, you know, here are the main points here, and here are the main points here, and, you know, somewhere in between lies the truth.
Right. So we're coming to the end of our time, and one last trick question for you. So in Pitkin County, we have female women leadership of the Republicans and the Democrats.
Yes.
And when I'm back lobbying, I'll be with women legislators, and they'll be talking about the deals being made, and the phrase will be, there's a little too much testosterone in the room right now. So do we need more women in government?
Number one, I'm for people who are effective in government. I do think women have a lot to bring to the table. They do come at a lot of issues from a different perspective than men often do. And women may be a little better at compromising and finding a way to try to meld a lot of different viewpoints. So I think I'm saying it would be a good thing if more women became involved. I think it would be a very good thing if more people became involved in politics. I mean, fundamentally, this affects all our lives. And I don't think you have the luxury of sitting back and saying, I'm not going to pay any attention to these issues or to politics. Politics is the way issues get decided. And so I think all of us should be a lot more involved. And I don't think we take seriously enough the wonderful gift we've been given of the right to vote. I mean, when you look at the statistics of how many people vote in any given election, it's shocking. I just came back from Peru,
right? And
I was told by our guides in Peru that voting is mandatory in Peru.
And Australia and a few other places.
And in Australia. I'm kind of thinking that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, thank you.
Thank you,
Anybody who's
Steve.
watched this segment, hopefully has gotten educated, entertained, and they now know what a class act Freida Wallison is. So
Well,
thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed our segment with Freida. And we've now had the Democratic Party chairman for Pitkin County and the Republican Party chairman, in both cases chairwomen, to talk about our lack of civility and perhaps offer some suggestions on how we can create more civility. The environment here in Aspen is relatively tame. We do have our moments of excitement, but under the leadership of Freida and Blanca, you know, it's relatively contained. But they do keep their toe in the national water, and I think you see they attend the conventions, and they know what's going on, and they understand that we've got to bring more civility to government. One of the areas where we lack civility, which does bother me quite a bit, and this is going to be my final piece on the deficit and on the budget, relates to the deficit part. As we said before, the deficit is growing every second, growing by billions every day, literally. And periodically, we have to have a conversation about what that debt ceiling is. Again, what's our credit card limit? What's our credit card limit as a country? And can it be raised or not? Now, there's a lot of factors that go into how much it should be raised, et cetera, et cetera. But there's been some lines drawn in the sand of late. And this conversation has been about whether or not the time of the deficit conversation should be the time for harsh rhetoric about fixing the budget and fixing other problems. It's kind of like a dare, triple dog dare that I'll stop the government or not, depending upon what I want to have done if I don't like what's going on, and then we'll have that vote impacted with the debt ceiling. Now, again, on this show, we don't take positions, and I'm not trying to say who's right and who's wrong, but I do want to suggest this to you, and this is what I find to be very unfortunate in the rhetoric and in the politics and in the fact that we don't have compromise these days. Right now, we have been in a period of time when the Republicans, and particularly the Tea Party element of the Republican Party, has been accused of trying to shut down government, and in fact shutting down government, and all the rhetoric about how harmful that might be to the system or not. Well, if you look back to when President Bush was in office, the Democrats were doing the same thing. In fact, President Obama gave floor speeches, has been quoted for his attacks on increasing the debt ceiling when President Bush was in office. So this is the part that I find most disingenuous and representative of the dysfunction and the polarization. It's not really a legitimate conversation about the debt ceiling at any point in time, and both parties are equally to blame. So at some point we have to decide that perhaps the debt ceiling is not the place to have this conversation. If one party was doing it, maybe we could drill down and figure out why they're doing it and perhaps why they were wrong. But now you have both parties doing it. Both parties, when they're in power, defend the right of the president to increase the debt ceiling. Both parties, when they're out of power, attack it vigorously, and threaten government shutdowns to surround this. So perhaps if Blanca's correct, and Freida in particular, who talked about the need to have conversation and have more civility, perhaps we can stop having these moments of extreme, and I hate that word extreme dysfunction around government shutdown and not, and all revolving around the debt ceiling. Our next guest is Nick Caters. Nick is the Associate Project Director on the School Board Project from our friends at Ballotpedia. As you know, Ballotpedia is a place I'm always trying to send our listeners to get more information on the political world. And in an earlier interview, we had chatted with Daniel Anderson, and Daniel is the head of the School Board Project. But if you'll recall from that interview, one of the things Ballotpedia is doing now is they're trying to map and get statistics, not just for congressional elections and state elections, but they're trying to drill down to the school board level. And I think that's an amazing project, and I salute them for doing this. If you would ask me what the biggest problem in America is today, I wouldn't be talking about dysfunction or polarization in politics. I'd be talking about our educational system. I think it's broken. I think it has to be fixed. And I think when we drill down with the folks at Ballotpedia and look at some of these statistics, and today look at how the voting occurs in school board elections, I think you see that part of the problem is that the process is just not being supported by the general electorate, and maybe we're not getting the quality that we want at the level that's running the school boards and the school districts to begin with. So Nick, welcome. Thanks for joining us here today. And I hope I said your name and your title correctly. What is the Associate Project Director for School Boards? What do you do?
Well, my focus as the Assistant Project Director is to oversee our elections coverage for the School Boards Project. So we cover the top 1,000 school districts in the United States based on enrollment, and we cover elections for all 1,000. There are some cases where there's appointed school boards. There's some cases where, in like Michigan and New Jersey, where you have elections that have been moved, and we haven't covered them yet. But we're covering elections in those top 1,000 school districts. I help organize that and sort of determine what to do with the information that we gather from those elections.
So if you're dealing with elections at the national level or perhaps a state level, you pretty much know they're going to be in November. When you're trying to track school board elections, they could be any day of the week, any month of the year almost, couldn't they?
Yeah, so we began covering school board elections in August of 2013. Between August of 2013 and November 5th of 2013, there were 6 different election dates for school districts that we were covering in the top 1,000. A lot of those August, September, October elections have relatively low turnout. They're spread throughout the country. But yeah, you don't have this one unified date for every single school district election in the United States.
Any idea what the history of that is? Why school boards don't get elected on the general election day in November or whatever?
Yeah, there are, a lot of this has to do with simply local control over elections, so that if you have municipal elections and school board elections, that they're controlled by county election boards rather than state election boards. So there may have been some determination back in the 19th century, even the early 20th century, in cases of newer states and newer localities, that you have an election at a certain time to separate it out from national elections or state elections. That you have some peculiar dates. I know that Tennessee has elections on Thursdays in August, for example. That a lot of this has to do with sort of local control. And one of the reasons that people who advocate for separate dates, what they say is that they want to keep local elections and nonpartisan elections, when possible, separated out from state and national elections that are usually partisan.
But I think what you're finding, and one of the things we want to talk about today, is that when you have these odd dates at odd times, among other things, the turnout is abysmal.
That's right. Yeah. If you look at even some of the November elections that we covered, that you had, in many cases, turnout between 10 and 15%. In the case of those elections I mentioned in August, September, October, looking at some of those elections, that you might have a turnout between 7 and 12%. So the voter turnout is very, very low for these types of elections.
And Nick, when you say turnout, on one of our earlier shows, we distinguished between turnout as a percentage of the total number of people that could have registered in the beginning and voted, and then there's turnout based upon the number of registered voters. So when you give a statistic, say there was a 10% turnout, is that of the total eligible population or just the registered population?
The numbers I gave are registered.
So 10% of the registered, which means of the total available, you could be at 5% or something, right?
That's right, yeah.
Very low. Are you seeing it, conversely, are you seeing any school boards where you're seeing a decent turnout, 50, 60% turnout, or that just doesn't happen?
You do have some school board elections where you have turnout between 35 to 45%. You have some that push 50%. Right there in your own backyard in Colorado, there were a few elections, Denver Public Schools, Douglas County School District, that they were elections that sort of hovered around 40, 45% turnout. And in part that is because you have other elections, or you had other elections going on in November, namely Amendment 66 and some of the other ballot measures that sort of helped push up some of the turnout, or at least in this case, handing in mail-in ballots.
Right, and for those of you that aren't familiar with the particular Colorado vote, the vote you were talking about was a vote to actually raise taxes or raise revenues for schools, so that was a pretty decent turnout for that election.
That's correct.
And that happened to, again, be a school board election that was on the general election day.
That's right, yes.
But for some of these August dates and whatever, you're seeing a 5 or 6% turnout, or maybe a 10%, but 5 or 6% of the total number that could have voted in the first place.
Right.
And
yes.
then I assume most of these elections require a majority vote to win, or a plurality. Excuse me. What are the requirements?
Yeah, typically you'll either have a primary and a general election. So you might have 3 or 4 or more candidates in a handful of cases that run for a particular seat, and the primary narrows it down to 2, and those 2 candidates run in the general election date. Or you do have some cases, I can think of Atlanta Public Schools in Atlanta, Georgia, where some seats had more than 2 candidates run, and they go to a runoff a couple weeks after the election.
These are generally nonpartisan elections?
Yeah, there's only a few cases where you have some partisan school elections. I'm thinking of some districts in Georgia, Connecticut, I know Syracuse, New York. There are a couple of bigger districts in New York that have partisan elections, but for the most part, they're nonpartisan.
And then we were talking earlier, actually, before we started the show today, that in some areas, at least one particular we're talking about, there are designated seats for sometimes minority participants?
That's correct, yes. In the state of Connecticut, this is the example that I'm familiar with, then the state of Connecticut, state law requires that local boards with partisan elections have a minimum of 3 minority party representatives.
So that's in Connecticut, but not necessarily in other states.
Yeah, that's just the Connecticut state law. I haven't really come across any state laws like that in any of the other states that we covered.
But other than electing the minority representatives, are there any unique voting requirements, a certain percentage of the vote for someone, or the only minority representatives vote on those seats, or does everyone vote for those seats?
Everyone votes for those seats, and essentially what they do is they'll take the top however many seats are up. So if it's in the case of Bridgeport Public Schools, there were 5 seats up. They look at the top 5. If anyone sort of runs up against that minimum, they'll sort of go to the next candidate and they'll sort of figure it out from there. But everyone votes on all of the candidates on the ballot. So
Bridgeport is actually an example, I think a fascinating example of how low turnout can swing things here. You and I were talking, and the population of Bridgeport was somewhere around 60,000, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Now, we didn't know how many of those 60,000 would be eligible to register to vote, but even if it was half, and I'm sure it was more than half, you'd have 30,000 people arguably could register and could vote in the election. And what was the turnout for that election?
It was some 4,600 votes. Just doing some quick math, I think that's around 15%.
Based on our 30,000 number, but
Oh, I'm sorry. Based on our 30,000.
Yeah, like 15% or 60. Whatever.
Yeah, something. I mean, it's a relatively low turnout.
But this was a very interesting election because there was a group that had come in to establish some reforms. Other people hadn't necessarily reacted well to those reforms. So there was some energy around this election, yet you only had maybe a 15% turnout at best.
That's right. So just to give a little bit of backstory, for Bridgeport Public Schools, you had a case where you have a state takeover of the district in 2011 that you have after the state Supreme Court finds that the takeover was in fact unconstitutional, that you have a new superintendent and you have in fact new elections in 2012 to determine the composition of the Board of Education. And the people who sort of controlled the Board of Education prior to November 5th of 2013, and in fact the superintendent, wanted to bring about reforms. They looked at poor academic performance, they looked at some financial struggles for the district, and they began to sort of add some new elements and experiment with some new ideas in that district. What happens in September of 2013 is that you have 3 Democratic members of the board who were pro-reform and pro-superintendent, Paul Vallis, that's the superintendent in this case, that they are challenged by 3 newcomers. They are against Paul Vallis. They are against some of these reforms. They feel that they're harming the performance overall of the district. And in fact, those 3 challengers in the Democratic primary in September of 2013 win. And in fact, they win the seats in the general election on November 5th. So you see some significant change there. Now, as you mentioned, there's a lot of energy surrounding this. But again, you have a relatively low voter turnout in a medium-sized city with a lot of issues in its public schools.
And that's what I think is stunning to me, whether it's Bridgeport or somewhere else. And again, we're not here to say who should win these elections, but if 4,600 people voted, my math tells me just one more than 2,300 was needed to win a seat. So you have a case where the entire school board and the schools of this Bridgeport, Connecticut, are going to be run by people who got elected with, 8% of the total vote. So what is this? What is Ballotpedia's take on this low turnout and the impact of these low turnouts?
Well, we don't take necessarily a position on this. We simply provide sort of a neutral and nonpartisan source of information. But certainly the conclusion that you can draw from some of this raw data is that Low voter turnout means that you can have significant swings from one set of board members to another set of board members with only a few hundred, or even in this case, a few thousand votes. If you switch a few hundred votes here and there, and some of these other candidates who didn't win end up getting those votes, then you have a different composition of the board. So low voter turnout means that it is easier to swing control over a board of education, in this case, from one set of policies to another set of policies. And because of low voter turnout, it doesn't take very much money and it doesn't take very much effort to actually sort of push in one direction or the other.
Well, these are great statistics, Nick, and I want to encourage all our viewers to find your site, drill down, and maybe get educated on their own districts and look at their turnouts. We've been encouraging people to register to vote, to turn out to vote, get active in issues. And if there's any place you want to turn out and vote and get active, to me, it's got to be on education. So, Nick, if someone wants to go to Ballotpedia and see your work and look at some results, where should they go? What should they do?
Go to ballotpedia.org. And on that page, you'll find a link to the School Boards Project. And what we do is we not only cover elections, but we look at school districts, school policies. We have some great articles, one dealing with the Common Core curriculum implementation throughout the United States. We have some sort of specific looks at things like school district budgets. We're looking at, we started to look at school violence in the United States, the history of it going back to 1990. So, we're building this up over time, and we'll add more information as we go along. And we're starting to get into election coverage with Oklahoma elections coming up in February of this year.
Thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure anybody that goes to that site is going to be amazed with what they find. So, best wishes to everyone back at Ballotpedia, and thanks again.
Thank you so much for your time.
Well, we're at the close of another show. We certainly hope you were educated and we hope you were entertained. I particularly hope you enjoyed the discussion about lack of civility in government over the last two programs and perhaps came away with some notions of how we can get the discourse more towards the center and more towards compromise. I also hope you enjoyed that last segment where we started looking at some of the election-related problems and dysfunction problems that surround school boards. One of my main theories and causes in life is our educational system, whether it's my children or other children. I've taught in school. I do substitute teaching. I feel very strongly about the fact that our system of education has got to be made better. And we have to recognize that a lot of it is political, and we've got to start focusing on the political aspects of education. For today's program and our homework assignment, you've had a lot of homework assignments of late, and we're going to try and take it easy on you for this one. Just want to suggest that you take some time to maybe get up to speed on how the budget works and what this deficit issue is about. In our country, we always talk about not wanting to see sausages and legislation getting made, and it's really ugly to watch the discourse and the dysfunction that surrounds the budget and the deficit. And I think if you took some time to understand this a little better and then communicated with your elected officials and expressed your voice, that would be part of the solution of how we're going to get the system better. Remember, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.